All right, I think around verse 24 is where we were at. We stopped, I think, around verse 23, of course, of chapter 26 in the book of Acts. And of course, Paul in this section is in the middle of, I'm going to call it testifying, for lack of a better word, before Agrippa. But again, this is not a legal proceeding. This is more of just an audience. Paul has already made that appeal to Caesar, to Festus, and we're going to see at the end of this chapter that evidently, when a Roman citizen did that, that pretty much put a halt to any other legal proceeding that was going on, and that once that was made, then that Roman official, once that appeal was made by the citizen, the Roman official had to honor that, and evidently in a pretty speedy manner. You know, one of our guarantees, supposedly, in our judicial system is what, as far as having things done?
Speedy trial.
Yeah, supposedly a speedy trial. Now, of course, you know, there's a lot of things, especially in trials today, that lawyers can do to slow that down. You know, I guess, I don't know, I guess there's no limit to motions that lawyers can make to the judge, and the judge has to deal with those kind of things. But evidently, once you got to that point of making that appeal to Caesar here, everything else, that was it. And as Festus said, you've appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you're going to go.
In our system, the defendant pretty much calls the shots. The prosecution cannot say, we need more time to prepare for this case. If
Yes.
the defendant says, no, I want to do this right away.
Right, exactly.
But the defendant then can put it off, you know, time and time again. But mainly with the argument, we need more time to prepare. We need to look at the evidence. So,
Right.
But yeah, in this situation, it's pretty obvious that Paul kind of had the upper hand as far as the speedy trial was concerned.
Yeah, exactly. And he and of course we've talked about this, but you remember that both Felix and Festus seemed a little bit inclined to want to favor the Jews in this conflict a little bit, or at least somewhat. And Paul basically got to the you know, once even Felix said, well, why don't we just go to Jerusalem and take care of this? And it's okay, that's it.
Yeah.
There's no need. He said, this is where this needs to be handled. You're the one that needs to be taking care of it, and if you're not going to do it, I appeal to Caesar. And that was okay. And that's it. So what's happening here in front of Agrippa and Bernice? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's Agrippa wanting to hear Paul's story, and it's almost just a matter of curiosity as much as anything, wanting to know what's going on. Of course, Agrippa has some jurisdiction, but again, this is not a legal proceeding. He's, you know, Paul even mentions in this testimony, Agrippa, these things weren't done, and I think in the New American Standard says in a corner, talking about the spread of the gospel and the story of Jesus. And you've heard these things, and you know what's going on. So it's basically Agrippa wanting to hear what Paul is saying, wanting to hear the story of Paul, and maybe just to be a somewhat conscientious monarch of sorts, and keeping up with what's going on under his rule. So Paul begins to talk to him, and he tells him what's happened, and then he goes back and even then recounts basically Paul's own story, even back to the beginning where he was a persecutor of Christians. Then he talks about his own conversion, Jesus appearing to him, and what happened there, and then talks about how the Jews now are basically out to take his life if that were possible. And then he begins here at this section that we just kind of finished. He starts to even preach a little bit in what he says to Agrippa. He reminds Agrippa that he was stating nothing. This is at the end of verse 22. But what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place. So he appeals back to that, and we're going to see that even though we talked about this and we knew Agrippa's background and having somewhat of a Jewish background, Paul does this to appeal to Agrippa himself. If there's one thing about Paul, can you think of a time he ever did not take an opportunity to preach the gospel? I can't think of a time. And even here, in this situation, which I would classify it as somewhat hostile to him, he is a prisoner still, after all. He still takes this opportunity, since Agrippa has called him to speak before him, to have this audience before him, that he is now going to take that opportunity to bring the gospel to him. And so he said, then in verse 23, that, in other words, what's he talking about in the prophets and Moses? Going to take place, that the Christ was to suffer, the coming Messiah was to suffer, this verse 23, and that by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he would be the first to proclaim light both to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. All right. And of course, Paul has said, that's why I'm here today. That's why I'm in the situation that I'm in. So he gets to that point in his testimony, and then let's see what happens next in verse 24. Unless someone has a question or a comment you'd like to make before we jump into new territory. All right, verse 24. While Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus, in a loud voice. I think that's kind of interesting. It's almost as if Festus is wanting to take command or take control of the situation a little bit, or else maybe he's just so what he has to say, he's just so astounded by the things Paul has said that he can't stop himself from basically yelling this out. Paul, you are out of your mind. In other words, said, wait a minute, Paul, are you crazy? And what prompted that? What prompted that outburst?
His talk of
Paul said.
His talk of the resurrection.
Exactly, and we'd seen that earlier, didn't we? Because even Festus said, and he keeps in his story something about this guy that died and is still alive,
or he says he's still alive.
Yeah, and says he's still alive, and all of that, and so Festus was kind of primed anyway that on that particular part of the story. Now here Paul starts talking about this Christ, this Messiah, to be resurrected from the dead again. And I think that's the trigger here for Festus to make this outburst. Paul, are you crazy? Are you out of your mind? Festus was listening. Oh, certainly. Of course, you remember Festus was kind of in a bind too, wasn't he? What was his issue in this whole situation? What was his problem?
His problem? Yeah, trying to make both happy. Yeah.
Right, but I mean, as far as sending Paul to Rome,
he had to have charges.
Yeah, you remember he told Agrippa, I don't know what to tell the emperor. You know, he's appealed to the emperor. I don't know what to send with him to tell him what the charge is. And so he's paying great attention anyway. And then when he gets to this point once again, that we know that he has already honed in on before and brought out now, that he just it's almost like he just can't take it any longer, at least as far as that part of the story. Paul, are you out of your mind? Your great learning is driving you mad. You know, I was trying to think of something similar, but we do sometimes talk about people that sometimes some people are so smart. How would you finish that as far as a negative situation?
But they lack common sense.
Yeah, many times they lack common sense. Many times they don't relate to an average person and those kind of things. And I kind of see Festus saying something at least similar to that here, where he says, Paul, obviously you're a learned man. He said, but I mean, but all this has driven you crazy. I laugh sometimes. There's a lot of times in TV shows and things, especially folks that aren't that smart, they talk about, or it's implied that their mind will only hold so much, and once they learn something new, it forces something else out that they don't know any longer. And I think that's kind of funny. And Festus may even be saying, hey, wait, you've learned so much that you don't even know what you're talking about anymore. And at least that's what I hear him saying here. Said, but again, I think it's obvious that it's in reaction to the mention of the resurrection of Jesus once again. But in verse 25, Paul answers him very quickly. Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus. Go ahead and call me crazy. I'm still going to give you the respect you deserve. But I utter words of sober truth. Verse 26, for the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence. He says, all right, first of all, he said, I assure you, I'm not out of my mind. And he gives him, again, the proper respect that he deserves as an officer of Rome here. He said, but I want you to know, he said, these words are truth. They are sober truth. They're serious truth here that I'm uttering. I'm not making it up. It's not something that's just out of the mind of a person that's lost his mind. And then he brings who to witness for himself.
The king.
Yeah, the king himself said, and you can imagine him on this point, he said, the king knows what I'm talking about. It's almost, ask him. And Paul is going to ask him here very shortly. He said, and I speak to him also with confidence, as I'm persuaded, and I referenced this earlier, that none of these things escape his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. He says, all right, you Romans may not have paid that much attention to this movement of Christianity, but I guarantee you that Agrippa knows what's going on, because these things have not been done in secret, and I guarantee that these things have not escaped his notice.
Could it be that, and I need to get all this straight, Festus is in Caesarea, right? Which is basically just.
Have I got it wrong? Have I been saying the wrong name?
No.
Okay.
Okay,
Right, Festus. Right.
And so it appears that his
authority?
His area of authority geographically
Right.
is Palestine and just areas peripheral.
Evidently.
Palestine.
Yeah. I don't have all this 100% straight either.
I'm just assuming this, and then you look at Agrippa, who's a king, and I assume because he is Herod Agrippa, he's a tetrarch, which means his territory is much broader. Mm-hmm. And you think about, it may be that Festus is not that aware of what's going on in Asia Minor and Macedonia and all the places that Paul has been. Because you think about all those things that happened in those journeys with Paul, his being left for dead and his causing an uprising. Where was it? In Ephesus, where they all gathered together in the Colosseum, basically.
Yeah, the silversmith uprising.
Yeah, and so that's why I think he can say to Agrippa, the king knows what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this hadn't been done in a corner. He's heard about the things that have happened to me and those who are following you. That's just
right. Agrippa is I don't know if he's the next highest in the quote chain of command, and there may have even been some blurred lines there. I don't know for sure. I just, again, it's hard to understand, but obviously Felix' domain, if you want to call it that, but I'd probably call him a governor, maybe today. And Agrippa's domain would have been much larger. And how far it extended, I can't really tell you. But And I think, though, the main point of all this is that Paul is trying to bring out here is that Agrippa had a Jewish background.
Yeah.
And Agrippa, no, just like did you already ask him that, or have I missed it?
He's going to ask him in the next 27.
Yeah, but he's getting ready to talk about, he said, don't you believe, I know you believe the prophets. So he's been raised basically as a Jew, even though, like I said, my understanding is the family was not racially Jewish, but they had, back there for several generations, they had converted to Judaism, so that influence was still upon Agrippa, even though he didn't, like so many people today, he knew what was right, but he didn't necessarily want to do what was right. And again, even this situation with, you can imagine sitting there with his sister next to him, and again, whatever was going on in that particular situation. But again, historically, at least there's a good chance that there was an incestuous relationship happening there, but there's no way for us to be sure about that. Anyway, I don't know if I rambled enough to confuse you more,
No.
or probably didn't help any, but anyway, but he said, Paul reminds us, said, I know you know what's going on, Agrippa. These things weren't done in secret. This movement was not one that's and think about it, in Jerusalem, which again, a major city in that region, what happened? They gathered at the temple, the Christians every day, and especially at Pentecost, when the church was established, and all those people, thousands of people were converted and were baptized into Jesus, and we see that, and then thousands later, and all of that going, and even the ministry of Jesus even before that, and all the uproar of that cause. And so he just reminding Agrippa, he said, don't even try to act like you don't know what's going on here. He said, you know what's happened. These things weren't hidden. These things weren't covered up. These things were not done, as this translation says, in a corner. I've got a footnote here. I didn't look it up. I'm just going to see real quick. Yeah, it just says in a corner literally means a hidden or a secret place. In other words, these things were not done in secret or not hidden. So verse 27, now he buttonholes Agrippa just a little harder. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Okay, so first of all, he asked him a very important question. But why did he ask him that question, do you think?
Well, anybody who professes Judaism is going to have to speak highly of the prophets.
Exactly. And I may be stretching this a little too far, but that's all right. It won't be the first time. Hopefully it won't break. But a good lawyer, I've heard this mentioned several times. They said supposedly, and this may just apply to TV lawyers, I don't know, but they say a good lawyer never asks a question in court that
they don't know the answer.
He doesn't know what the answer is going to be. In other words, if you don't know, if you've got a witness up there and you don't know, or at least have a pretty good idea of what that answer is going to be, you don't ask that question. Now, does that apply to Paul here? Absolutely. It's almost rhetorical, isn't it? He said, because
he answers his own question. Yeah.
What?
He answers his own question.
Yeah, exactly. So I know you do. He doesn't even give him a chance. He said, King Agrippa, do you believe? And he's saying, he said, you believe the prophets. You understand the prophets. You've been raised. So I said, I know you believe the prophets. So it's basically rhetorical. Even it's not trying to find out information. He's just reminding him. All right, now look, I know you believe the prophets. Now, then in 28, notice, even though Paul's answered the question, Agrippa's going to answer anyway, and again, this tells me Agrippa's not too unintelligent, at least. I have no idea how intelligent he was, but he sees what's coming, doesn't he? He knows what Paul meant by asking that question. So let's see how he responds. Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. All right, so Agrippa realizes what by that response? that Paul is really asking him what?
How can you not believe in Jesus the Christ?
Yes,
if you
exactly.
believe the prophets, and I've explained to you how that Jesus fulfilled all that prophecy.
Yeah, exactly. He said, "I know you believe the law and the prophets, and I've proven that Jesus is the Messiah, the fulfillment of all of those. So, shouldn't you believe in these things?" And notice, and so he realizes what's being mentioned here, and what's being asked. And so now I want to focus on this reply here for a second. What is you should most of you probably can quote the King James, or at least be pretty close to it. What do you remember?
Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian.
Yeah, make sure you get your estes in there. Almost thou persuadest me to become a Christian. And we even had a song, an invitation song
Almost.
about that. Almost persuaded, right? But it's kind of interesting when you look at some of the other translations, you get something a little different. Let's just survey around real quick. Mine's New American Standard here, and it says, "In a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian." What else? What do some of the rest of you have in the different translations?
In the CSB, it says, "Are you going to persuade me to become a Christian so easily?"
All right, it turns into a question, doesn't it? Are you going to persuade me in such a short time to become a Christian? Now, that's a whole different meaning, isn't it? Or at least I take it as a whole different meaning. When you turn it into a question, what is Agrippa saying? I think you could interpret it of him saying, do you really think you're going to persuade me to be a Christian in this short a time?
Yeah, the New Living Translation. Do you think you can persuade me to become a Christian so quickly?
Yeah, exactly. Now, from what I read, and I tried to research this out at least a little bit, the almost word that's translated almost there it actually means in a short time.
Oh, really? Okay.
So that's, that part's legitimate to translate it in a short time. Now, the thing is he making a statement? Boy, in a short time, you're going to persuade me to be, and that almost sounds like the almost persuaded, doesn't it? But if you turn around to a question, do you really think in this short a time you will persuade me to be a Christian? It becomes a different thought. Which one do you lean to?
I don't know that it was maybe a little bit half serious. I think he said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa."
I think he hit a nerve.
Yeah, hit a nerve.
Definitely.
But I think he said, "Hey, wait a minute. We didn't bring you here for you to preach to me."
Yeah, he's definitely wanting Paul to
knock
he's
it
trying
off.
to head that off, isn't he? I kind of lean toward the idea that the question interpretation here, that he's saying, he said, really in this short a time you think you can convince me to be a Christian? Because I think that would fit the situation a whole lot better. But maybe I'm not giving enough credit.
If you look at Paul's response, that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm going with, the whole context here. But maybe I'm not giving enough credit to Paul's persuasive powers and the power of the gospel itself. And so it's possible. I'm not saying my interpretation is the right one. From what I've read, either one of those is acceptable from the manuscripts that we have. It could be interpreted either way. So let's look ahead then. 29, so Paul said, "I wish to God that whether in a short time or a long time." So you notice, I would think again, Mark just mentioned this, I would almost think if Paul thinks he's about got him, that he wouldn't let him off the hook so easily. But he seems to here, doesn't he? He says, you know what? He said, whether it's in a long time or a short time, not only you, but all those who hear me this day might become such as I am. What does that mean?
As a Christian.
As a Christian. And then he says, except for these chains. In other words, so you know what? All of those gathered here, Agrippa, even, he's even talking to Festus and Bernice, and evidently there's a large crowd gathered. because Agrippa wanted it that way. You know, he wanted to be honored and to for this to be a big occasion there in Caesarea, and so Paul says, you know what, everyone gathered here. He said, whether it takes a short time or a long time, I wish everyone that's hearing my voice would become like me. In other words, have an obedient faith in Jesus Christ. And he said, the only thing I don't wish upon you is that it causes you to be found as a prisoner or in chains, as I am at this time. Verse 30, the king stood up, and the governor and Bernice and all those who were sitting with them. So basically that did what?
So it's over.
When the one in charge stands up and basically indicates he's done, it's done. Okay? There's not a question. Even if Paul tried to continue further, he would have probably been silenced at this point. So basically that's the signal. Hey, this particular proceeding is over. When they had gone aside, they began talking to one another. So evidently Paul is taken away. And now you have this, as we do. What happens when anytime you have a group of people together and the proceeding concludes?
We start talking to one another.
Yeah. and I can't think of a time that doesn't happen, unless you just absolutely, no one knows each other at all. And even that point, that doesn't stop us many times. But I see that happening here. So we see at least Agrippa and Festus and I don't know how, we don't know how many others here. He said, but they began talking to one another, and they said, this man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. All right. Now, you've got to give them a little credit here, I think, for admitting the truth of the situation. They've heard the story, and you can almost imagine Agrippa addressing Festus and saying, okay, is that what Paul says? Is that how you understand that things happen? And what would his answer have been? Yeah, as far as I know, yeah, he told the truth. There's nothing there I can argue with that he had to say. And he said, and so they talked, and they said, well, what's he doing here in prison? Why is he in chains? And especially somebody, the Jews from Jerusalem or from Asia as well, wanting to have him put to death. This man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. Now, when you hear the king and the governor say those words, we think what today? What would we think would be the next outcome? I know we know what it is. What would you think what would we expect it to be?
Set him free.
Paul, you're free. You're pardoned. You're done. Well, unfortunately, verse 32, and Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free had he not appealed to Caesar. And that's why I said what I said at the beginning of our session today, is that evidently when the citizen appealed to Caesar, that's it. That's the end of the legal proceeding. And as we said, this was not a legal proceeding anyway. But this was just Agrippa's request to hear Paul at this point. So I think that's we kind of have to make that assumption here. And we look at that, and immediately my sensibility said, that's not fair. That's not right. Why wouldn't they say, Paul, if you drop your appeal, we're going to set you free? But evidently, once that was made, it's written in stone, in Roman stone. and there was nothing that could be done, because that's basically what Agrippa says, is it not? Anyone have questions or comments?
The Lord had told Paul that he
Yes.
was wrong.
Yes.
Yes, exactly right. Now, yes, now that's a different side of the story. Exactly right. We're not. We're kind of looking at it from Agrippa and Felix's side here now. But yes, God had already told Paul what his part of at least some of what his mission was going to be. Even in Acts chapter 9, he said, you know what, you're going to testify before, not only before Gentiles, but before kings, plural, not just before a king, but before kings, and taking this testimony all the way to Rome. So we know that this was the will of God, the will of that was passed along to Saul and Ananias, that was eventually passed on to Paul, of what his mission was going to be. You can almost imagine, and again, I'm just reading this into the situation, you can almost imagine, as Joan said, that Paul might have been disappointed had he been released at this point. He might have even said, well, wait, now how am I going to get to Rome now? But it was pretty obvious to him, I think, as it is to us, God's hand in this particular situation.
And Agrippa said,
that was God's will.
Agrippa didn't say this man would have been set free. He said he might have been set free. And because Festus in the previous chapter had asked Paul if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem. And that was the thing that really generated this idea in Paul's mind about appealing to Caesar. Had he not appealed to Caesar, he probably would have gone back to Jerusalem, and we don't know whether he would have been set free or not. Probably not.
He may not have survived.
He might have gotten killed on the way, basically. So, but it's interesting that he would make the comment.
Yeah, exactly right. But it's what we see here is, of course, it just, in a way, it's a little bit satisfying to see that at least the Roman officials looking at the situation and agreeing with how we see the situation as well, that Paul obviously had done nothing worthy of being imprisoned or certainly to being put to death, which is what the ultimate goal of the Jews at this point, because Paul had caused such a ruckus, not really in Jerusalem. Remember, it was caused on Pentecost, when the Jews from Asia that it came down from places to observe Pentecost, they were there legitimately. Right. And they happened to see Paul there, and they said, "Whoa, we've seen him before. Yeah, he's that guy that stirred up all the trouble in our town. Wait, he was in your town? Yeah, he was in. Oh, you should have seen all the disturbance he made in our town. And the things that he had to say, preaching against the law of Moses and all of that. And of course, that's how all this started. All the arrest and such, with Paul being rescued by the Roman authorities from the mob of the Jews. Had the Jews been left to their own devices, Paul would have not been alive even until this point, I don't believe. Of course, again, with realizing that a lot of this is the intervention of God and God's will for Paul to accomplish as well.
And Paul was pretty good, apparently, at testifying in his own behalf. Most defense attorneys don't like for their clients to get on the stand and face questioning, especially if their innocence is questionable. Paul I think, felt confident enough in his innocence that he, and being as learned as he was, he did okay defending himself.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. Again, most of my court experience is watching on TV, which I'm sure that's not too well. I'm sure it's not a very accurate representation. The main thing that I think is not very accurate is the pace at which things proceed.
Yeah.
You can watch an hour-long show, and man, you can see everything from beginning to end. You got, of course, a real court proceeding. It's not gonna do that, and it goes so slowly. I've been on I did federal jury duty a few years ago in Fort Smith, and man, it just it took 4 days, and it was a fairly simple situation, but it's just they call this witness and that witness, and then this person objects, and they and all of that goes on, and like I said, it took us 3 or 4 days just to the deliberation took practically a couple hours when the judge gave us the case to decide. But just all the witnesses and things, and you think, why is that witness here? It doesn't even it didn't add anything to anybody's story, defense or the prosecutor, and everybody, and both lawyers giving way too much background and talking way too much themselves, taking up way too much time. The judge even admonished the defense lawyer for that in this particular trial that I was serving on. But anyway, I know that, like I said, the real world's way different than the TV world of these things. But it's kind of interesting to parallel that to what we know of our particular court system. Well, we're about out of time, so we'll start in chapter 27 next time. You have a heading on 27?
Paul is sent to Rome.